everyone, welcome to the fourth video. In this one we're going to talk a bit about writing and the writing process, specifically more at structure and style. So first off, just a few words about getting started, and particularly about the idea of time management in connection with getting started. Probably the best thing you need to do first off is just think about when do you actually need to start your essay. So you have quite a lot to do. You have various research, you have writing, you have editing. We'll talk about all of this. So you really want to think about starting kind of as early as possible. So, I mean, if you have a deadline months and months away, maybe unless it's your dissertation, you don't need to start working on it right now. But you probably want to start earlier than you think you do. The one thing you really want to avoid is kind of that last minute rush. So what you want to do is think about when your deadline is and kind of work backwards from there and leave time for all of the stages. So make sure you don't just think of it as you need to do a bit of research and a bit of writing and then send it off, but make sure you leave time for all the different stages of the writing process. So what are these stages? So the research and the writing process is actually quite a varied process. It isn't just a linear kind of you do a bit of research, you do a bit of writing, you hand it in. It's a lot more complicated than that. So what does it involve? First off, you want to start by doing some thinking. So as we talked about in a couple of videos ago, you want to think about your topic, think about what ideas really interest you and what do you want to investigate farther. So spending some time thinking before you actually spend time researching, and definitely before you spend time writing, ensures that the ideas that you've got here are your own and they aren't just your first thoughts, kind of the first thing that springs into your head, but they are your considered ideas, your best ideas, if you would. After thinking, you're going to spend some time researching. We already talked about this a few videos ago. So you come up with your thoughts and then you research, you dig into them, you see what other people have said. Then you want to do a bit of writing. So you research some, you structure, which we'll talk about in a minute, and you start the writing process. You start putting your ideas into words. And you might think this is kind of getting towards the end, you write and then you submit, right? But actually there's a bit more to it. Because the writing process and the research process is slightly more complicated. And so you go back to revising your thoughts. And at this point, you're going to actually return to some of the earlier stages. So you might do a bit more thinking at this point, and you might do a bit more researching at this point. So you can return to some of the earlier stages, do a bit more thinking, a bit more researching, a bit more writing, and that feeds into your editing. So don't be afraid to, as you say, sort of move back a stage to stop your writing for a bit and do a bit more research if you find there's an area you don't know about. Often have students tell me like, oh, I've done the research already, when actually research and writing are really quite bound up together. So after you've done some revising, and then you'll move into proofreading. And this is the tiny line edits, making sure your spelling is good and your grammar, making sure your references are correct, all of that sort of thing. And you want to save that for the very end because there's no point in making sure that you've got all the punctuation in exactly the right place if you suddenly realize that your whole paragraph is actually incorrect and you're going to have to totally throw it out and write a new paragraph. So you want to save the tiny proofreading stuff for the very end. At the same time, as I mentioned in an earlier video, you do not want to leave your bibliography for the very end. You should be writing your bibliography already during the research stage, the very second thing you're going to do. You want to be writing your bibliography at that point so that you aren't frantically combining it at the very end. So I want to talk very briefly now about structure and about what an essay structure should look like. Your autonomy assignment is a little bit more unusual because it has several parts, but the assignment brief will lay that out really neatly for you with kind of approximate word count for each of those sections. So I'm going to talk about structure quite broadly, and we can apply that to your assessment in particular. So you want to think about first your introduction, and your introduction should start kind of broadly and then narrow things down to a point, perhaps to a specific thesis sentence that says what you're going to talk about. So you might begin by talking about, say, ideas of leadership are really important in nursing, and then by the end of it, you'll have brought it right down to your thesis about the importance of collaborative leadership for female newly qualified practitioners. whatever kind of the narrow topic it was. So your introduction is really where you do that kind of big picture stuff and then narrow it down, just like we did in an earlier video. Then the main body of your essay focuses in on that narrow area and explores it in detail. This is where a lot of your research goes. This is where your ideas go and your argument. This is the real meat of your essay. And then your conclusion opens things up again. It takes the really narrow bit and it might kind of recap a lot of what you talked about and broaden it out and apply it to kind of the big area, say leadership again. Another way of looking at it, an introduction is where you introduce your question or your topic of the essay, and you introduce any key themes, key ideas, key words that you're going to talk about. Then the main body is your analysis, your argument, where you look very closely at the sources and explain them. And then finally, the end is the summary of what you talked about and any important implications. This is kind of where you answer the why or the so what of your essay. And in something like your autonomy essay, you may well end up having this structure sort of replicated in your two different sections. You've kind of one more theoretical part and then one more reflective part. We'll talk about reflective writing in the next video. But you may have kind of mini introductions and mini conclusions to each section. But of course, the overall introduction, the overall conclusion at the beginning and the middle and at the end, sorry, of your essay. So one of my top tips also is to take a good look at kind of the word count you're allowed for each section, and plot out how you're going to spend that. And a good rule of thumb is that your introduction and your conclusion should each be worth kind of approximately 10% of your word count. So say you have a 2,000 word essay, your introduction should be approximately 200 words, and your conclusion should be approximately 200 words as well. This is approximate, so if you have 100 words for each of those, that's okay. If you have maybe up to 300 words for each, that's okay. But you really don't want to be going over that or under that. The 10% rule is a good rule of thumb. And then when you've kind of allotted certain numbers of words for your introduction and for your conclusion, you want to think about how many words you have left. So say you have 200 words for introduction, 200 words for conclusion, it's a 2,000 word essay, that leaves you with 1,600 words left. And then suppose in your main body, you have 4 main points that you want to make. 1,600 words divided by 4, 400 words per point. So now 2,000 words might have sounded like a fairly long essay, a fairly big amount of work. But what you've actually got is 200 words for introduction, 200 words for conclusion, and then 4 points, each of which are just 400 words. And suddenly 2,000 words just breaks itself right down into a series of really short little sections. I'm sure all of us can really easily manage to do 400 words on one of our main points. So sometimes when you have a fairly daunting assessment, what you need to do is just think of it as a structure like this. Take your word counts, break them down point by point, and suddenly it feels like an awful lot more manageable. So I would advise if you're feeling a little bit daunted, do that and it will make you feel an awful lot better. And even if you're not feeling daunted, having things broken down like that will help you write in a much more logical, structured manner. And it will make sure that you don't accidentally say, write 1,000 words in your first point and suddenly realize that you've run out of space entirely for your final point. So breaking things down and structuring it out carefully at the beginning will save you a lot of time and effort towards the end of your writing process. So I just want to close this section of our video with a little discussion about academic style, because when we're writing essays as lecturers, we tend to get two different extremes of writing style. And we would tend to get some styles that involve maybe far too formal of a tone. And while it's not, like, you are supposed to be formal in your essays, this is not the same as spoken English. You also shouldn't be highfalutin. This is not something where you just have to sound as academic as possible. So I've put there, like, avoid simply using the synonym function. Because what some people do is they write a word and they think, oh, I don't sound academic enough. So they right click on it in Microsoft Word and you press synonym and then it gives you lots of fancier words. And that's not a great idea. We want to write formally. It isn't simply the way we talk, but we also don't want to just make things sound as fancy and as academic as possible, because that tends to actually just make our meaning really confusing and really unclear. So what exactly do I mean by that? Because it's all fine for me to say, oh, it's formal, but it's not highfalutin. What exactly does that mean? So I've got an activity that will help us work through this a bit. So pull up your workbooks and turn to activity 4. And what you'll find there are 3 sentences that all essentially say the same thing, but in very different ways. And what I want you to do is to identify which one of the sentences is the best kind of academic tone, but then also um, why it's best. I expect that you'll all fairly easily be able to tell which one is best, but what's so wrong about the other two, and also what's best about the one you think? And are there anything that isn't quite right about the one you like best anyways? So I suggest just pause the video for a second here, and then come back and I'll talk through it with us. So now if you had a chance to just briefly go through the activity, I'll just talk us through it at the moment. So the first version of the sentence goes like this, and it says, the government's plot to slash NHS funding doesn't think about poor people. So there's a couple things that are wrong with this, and one is that it uses quite biased language, so like the government's plot. And words like slash, for instance, it sounds kind of like one of those clickbait headlines you might find. There's also problems with it in terms of things like the word doesn't. When we're writing formally in academic language, we want to avoid using contractions like doesn't or isn't or can't, and instead we'd write them out in full. So doesn't would be does not. There's also the whole issue here about where I say doesn't think about poor people. So poor people isn't really the term we would use. You probably have your own ways of saying it in nursing particularly, but you might speak about lower income groups or disadvantaged people, or you'll know the terminology for your discipline, but poor people is a bit pejorative. The second example is just as bad. And it goes, the proposal generated by the Parliamentary Subcommittee on Public Health to diminish resources for the NHS disregards the requirements of disadvantaged people groups. So again, incredibly long, and this one is just overly formal. If the first one was far too informal, it sounded like something we might say or an incidentary newspaper headline. This one sounds like it's just full of legal speak and jargon, and it's needlessly long. There's no reason to go on about the proposal generated by the Parliamentary Subcommittee on Public Health. That's just far too wordy. Diminish resources for the NHS. I mean, it's not quite as bad as slash NHS funding, but it's just long and wordy and confusing. So with this sort of sentence, what you want to do is you just be kind of cutting out anything that isn't important, and you'd be changing some of the words to simpler words. So something like diminish resources isn't even quite right. So this brings us to our final one. And as you probably guessed, this would be the best of the examples. Still not perfect, perhaps, but it's probably the best example here of academic tone. So it says Parliament's suggestion to reduce NHS funding ignores the needs of low-income families. This is much better because it's much clearer. So it's Parliament's suggestion. It's not the government's plot. It's not the proposal generated by the Parliamentary Subcommittee on Public Health, but it is quite simply, quite clearly, Parliament's suggestion to reduce NHS funding. It's not slash NHS funding. It's not diminish resources for the NHS. It's just reduce NHS funding. Again, simple, clear, understandable, but formal. And then instead of disregards the requirements or doesn't think about, it says ignores the needs of low-income families. Again, simple and clear. Ignores is possibly a little bit pejorative, for instance. And it's also interesting that in this version it says low-income families. Before we've just had poor people and people groups. There's not been no mention of families before. And there's this, like, families is a much more emotive word. Like, we all care about families, right? So perhaps if we were going to be just evening this out, we might say something like ignores the needs of, say, low-income people rather than families. Because the word families has certain connotations, like quite positive connotations, and you think, how could Parliament possibly reduce NHS funding for poor families, right? But overall, this bottom one is the best example of academic tone because it is simple, it is clear, it's formal, but it's not needlessly complicated. So I hope that helped kind of explore some of the ways that we can go wrong, both in terms of being too informal or too formal, and also how academic writing can be very clear and straightforward, can be simple to understand, even as it is still formal. So I'll leave it there for now. So bye.